Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Pax Americana. I'm Julie Roginsky here with Olga Lautman. Good morning, Olga.
Morning.
Lots of stuff going on. Want to talk about the ceasefire quickly, but before that, there was news breaking overnight that I guess we've reached a mineral deal with the Ukrainians. Um, I don't really quite know what to think. There are no security guarantees. But maybe this will have Trump feel like there's some sort of investment in Ukraine.
I mean, following the minute by minute, honestly, is it really doesn't help because I mean, first of all, they signed this deal. Luckily, the Ukrainians, managed to strip out a lot of the insanity of the deal, including that, they have to pay back for prior weapons under a different administration. Um, And that's it. So, I mean, they signed it. I think it is one out of the first three. I think all three agreements have to be signed. I know that, they came to Washington yesterday and last minute the deal was delayed and then finally it was signed. I mean, as far as of whether it will have an effect on Trump, absolutely not. I mean, and the deal on the, when you go behind the deal, there are no American companies who are going to go into Ukraine that is an active war zone to go dig for minerals. So, until this is settled, and it's not going to be settled by negotiations, which we'll get through, it has to be honestly the only way to settle it is to get Russia the hell out of Ukraine. And that's it.
Yeah. Well, on that note, speaking of getting Russia the hell out of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin decided that he was going to propose a 3-day ceasefire to coincide with what they call Dень Победы, which is the Russian word for the anniversary of their victory over Hitler in World War II, a huge holiday in Russia, as it should be. But usually those kinds of anniversaries are commemorated on Red Square with a big parade and the leadership standing. What used to be Lenin's tomb, I don't know where they stand now. Potentially there also, but it's a big deal for them. It's a big kind of national holiday. So Putin presented a 3-day ceasefire to Ukraine, starting on May 8th, which is the anniversary of that war ending for the Soviet Union. And Ukraine rejected the delay and said, we want a month-long ceasefire. Now, what do you make of Putin's desire for a 3-day ceasefire, which, okay, 3 days is
I laugh because I mean this is clear. Like Putin is KGB. And he clearly is losing his touch because as Trump is rambling about a ceasefire, Putin had the two like fold, reason for it. One is to pacify Trump, and the second is Victory Day. And I mean, you and I know that this thing is like ingrained in you from like your first words. I
from the
mean, they
womb, yeah.
celebrate on May 9th is the actual parade. I watched them, and frankly, over the past, decades, it's quite hilarious. They march out there, fine as tanks that go on fire. And it happens in every main city across Russia. And it's the biggest spectacle. But I mean, literally, the whole country runs on Victory Day, even though May 9th is the parade. I mean, everything, every month goes back to the World War II victory. But more so, Putin did smart. He, one, wants to shut Trump up, and two, he doesn't want to be humiliated with Ukraine launching drone strikes on Red Square or any other main city that is hosting these festivities. Now, since the 2022 full-scale invasion, they have scaled back. Last year, I believe it was like, partly canceled. The sky was closed. And it was very, I mean, the past 3 years, it's been very, very scaled back. A lot of the outer regions and, have been canceled altogether. But here he has, like, I believe 9 or 10, world leaders coming. Can you just imagine drone strikes on the Russian military? I mean, this is like the perfect target. You have the Russian military, Russian tanks, and them,
That would be
parading.
humiliating. That would be,
So,
yeah,
so it was basically that. I mean, and again, if Russia was, which they're not, because first of all, if Russia was serious in any which way, the border, they know where the border is. They can easily end the war at any moment of their choosing by finding the border and crossing back into their own country. This, kind of was funny because it was so transparent. I mean, to see Putin come out and like think ahead, not let's start this weekend, not, no, he's thinking like 2 weeks ahead. So Ukrainians saw through, Europeans saw through, Europeans also came out and said, really, if you're so interested, let's start right now. Nope.
yeah, yeah. It's kind of, I mean, he's not even trying, right? It's like, well, I wonder
No.
what's happening around May 8th or May 9th, right? May 8th is VE Day, May 9th was, is the Russian slash Soviet victory day because they did it a day later. Okay. So,
Which they rewrote history for, because I don't know how many people know. They claim that it's the ethnic Russians, that fully defeated Hitler, and his forces. Meanwhile, I mean, you had the Soviet Union occupying so many countries, and you had many countries who took a heavy toll to, push back. But, when you read Russian history books, you're not going to hear about the Georgians or Ukrainians, Belarusians, or anyone else who,
just by virtue of the fact that Ukraine was closer, as is Belarus, to Germany, in that it is west, and the atrocities that were visited upon Ukrainians and Belarusians, they were visited upon the Russians too. But just to be clear about the toll that World War II took specifically on Ukraine, we've talked about Babi Yar before. That's just one example of one
yep.
horrific massacre in a ravine, which is now part of Kiev, but at the time I think it was right outside Kiev, of the entire Jewish community there that was taken to a ravine and executed and shot. And the reason for that is because the Russians were able to get there. They never got to Moscow. Um, so,
Yep.
for all of that, that's,
But you're not going to find that in
you're
Russian
not going to
history
find that in
books
Russian books.
anymore. I think to our American audience, just to connect Trump to Russia, Trump is using the same tactics now. You see every single website, basically erasing uh, past historical accomplishments by, women, by the Black community, and I mean, he's basically rewriting history in real time to make it look like it was just, white men who um, hey, call it, built and secured and did everything for America.
Yeah.
So you see the same exact tactics being here. It took Putin decades to start rewriting history books. Trump is doing it in less than 100 days.
Yeah. And then, of course, one of Putin's right hand people, also a good friend of Donald Trump, because he was allowed into the Oval Office when Trump was president the first time around, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia. I keep calling it the Soviet Union, but it's not yet.
I know,
Getting there.
pretty
Not yet.
much.
He, Olga, you wrote about this. He reiterated Russia's demands for peace negotiations with Ukraine. But what he outlined is not really a negotiation. It's a list of demands that one would make if they wanted unconditional surrender. And Hitler has shot himself in the bunker, and the Allies are approaching Berlin from the east and the west. That is not what is happening right now with Ukraine. In fact, after 3 years of war, the Russians have made gains of a couple of kilometers here or there. Not. Um, so right, but this is what he
And
demands.
going back to Trump,
Yeah.
takes credit that Russia didn't take all of Ukraine because of him. This is the most hilarious
Yeah.
thing. Look, Russia is evil. Their military is completely incompetent, as we've seen on the field. But they're evil in the tactics they use. Their strategic targets are playgrounds, apartment buildings when people are sleeping, schools, hospitals. But I mean, the fact, for everyone, who pays attention to Ukraine, we can all go back to Bakhmut, where they turned it literally into a meat grinder and were throwing tens of thousands of people to try to grab Bakhmut. 9 months it took. Bakhmut is like half the size of my neighborhood here in Staten Island. I
Yeah.
mean, it literally is like, a small town. And I mean, with Trump's fantasy, he thinks he stopped it. If Russia actually had the capability to take all of Ukraine, first of all, this is what they've been trying to do for 11 years and 3 years since the full scale invasion. So, I mean, sorry,
Yeah. I mean,
but just to
uh,
wipe out Trump's, grand
delusion.
delusion. Yeah.
But it's interesting because that's, of course, Lavrov, as we talked about, put out a list of demands. And I think it's interesting to think about before we go through the demands for people to consider why he did that. Part of it, I think, is for a domestic audience to make people in Russia believe that they are winning a war that they are not winning. I mean, they're just not. That's not an opinion. It's just militarily, they're not winning. Now, are they going to win when Donald Trump gives away the store? Potentially, but militarily, they're not winning. The other is I wonder if it was to send a message to Trump, who
Yes.
doesn't understand, to make Trump believe that they are winning. And so this is what
And
he,
he chose to give the comments to a Brazilian outlet. So he's also sending a message, of Russia's quote
yeah,
unquote dominance,
right,
to Latin America.
to Latin
So, I
America and
mean,
then to Brazil, which is one of the BRIC countries with which Russia is as well, right?
mhm,
So here's the list of demands. Ukraine must commit to not joining NATO. Okay. Um, let's
Trump
pause.
agrees.
Let's pause for a second and
Hmm.
wonder why it is that Ukraine would want to join NATO. Why didn't Canada want to join the Warsaw Pact back in the day? It may be because back in the day, although that's changed now, we were not aggressors against our neighbors and the Soviet Union, and now Russia is, and that's why um, Ukraine felt the need to join NATO, as did the Baltics, also three former Soviet republics, and others, right? Like Finland, Sweden, who never were NATO
Everyone
countries.
wants,
Everybody wants to
everyone
join
wants that
NATO
protection.
because everybody's afraid that Russia is going to invade them next. So maybe the best way to avoid people joining NATO is to not make them feel the need to join NATO, right? All right, so that's one. Ukraine must confirm neutral and non-block status. I didn't realize we were still in the East Bloc and the West Bloc. I thought those days were kind of over with the fall of the Berlin Wall. But just to put in people's mind the mindset that the Kremlin has, which is that the Cold War never ended,
Mhm.
that the Soviet Union must be reconstituted. If you remember Hitler, I'm sorry, whoops, there's a Freudian slip. Putin said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. And he still thinks of himself as the leader of an empire and the leader of the former Soviet Union, which is why there's a bloc. There's the Eastern Bloc, of which he wants to make Ukraine a part, and then Poland next. And then I guarantee you he's not going to stop there.
The Baltics,
The
they
Baltics.
actually practice military
Yep,
takeover of the
yep,
Baltics on TV for
yep.
entertainment for years.
Right. So, I have not thought about Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc countries except in a historic context for a very long time. Thank you for reminding me, Mr. Foreign Secretary, that apparently I have to start thinking about it again the way I used to back in the 80s. Um, Ukraine, and this part is my favorite. Ukraine must address neo-Nazi regime in Kiev. Okay, he's talking about Zelensky. So,
No, and he goes further because
yeah,
now we're talking about Poroshenko too, because it's after the coup
Right.
of 2014. So, not that the Ukrainian people themselves, apparently the US employs, a million plus CIA agents who posed and shapeshifted as Ukrainians to come out for 6 months and die in some cases, be tortured by, Russian mercenaries to try to disrupt Maidan. So no, it's not about the Ukrainian people, having their revolution. And then after Maidan was successful, and their puppet ran literally across the border to Russia, um, then, Ukrainians had a new election and Poroshenko was elected. So now he considers Poroshenko and Zelensky, everyone after Yanukovych fled, is apparently Nazis.
Yeah. Um, so, what I want to kind of dwell on for a moment here is just this insanity of calling a Jewish
Yes.
president of Ukraine a Nazi, right? Um, a guy who came to power to effectively reform the corruption that was happening. I'm not suggesting it's perfect, but the last thing that Zelensky was interested in was this, right?
Yeah.
I
Hmm.
don't know that Ukraine would have elected Zelensky if they, based on who he was before he got elected, which was an actor and a comedian, if they had anticipated that this was going to be the outcome. He's more than met the challenge, he has more than met the test. But the fact that you are accusing Zelensky of being a neo Nazi when the only people behaving like fascists and Nazis are Russians who are torturing people to the point where there was a journalist whose body was returned the other day, a Ukrainian journalist whose body was returned missing organs because they had tortured her so much they didn't want evidence. They had to remove many of her organs. This is
They
not,
removed her brain, her
yeah,
eyes, her larynx. She had cigarette burns and what are those shock things on her body?
yeah,
I mean, she was like her body. I mean, what came back of her body? I can't. I mean, it's just the most cruel and
yeah,
evil thing that
barbaric.
can happen, and this happens on a grand scale. This isn't a one-off. This is what happens to, including Ukrainian children kidnapped. I believe it was Project, or one of the Russian opposition investigative outlets did an investigation into the tortures of Ukrainian children being kidnapped in Russia. I mean, the abuses are unthinkable, and this is happening on a mass scale.
And the way they talk about Ukrainians, which I want to stress. So back in the Soviet days, you used to have passports, internal passports that everybody would have, and it would have. I think it was the fifth point. It was called Pятый пункт, which was I think it was the fifth kind of point on your passport, which would make you list your nationality. Your nationality, of everybody's nationality, of course, was Soviet, but what they meant by nationality is your ethnicity, right? And so, um, my parents were Jews. Not that they were born in they were born in Russia. They're had always been Russian, but their nationality was that they were Jewish. Just to show you, sort of, you want to talk about Nazi. Jewish was their religion. It was not their nationality, and yet, according to the authorities, their nationality was Jewish. Who else thought that way? The Nazis.
Mhm.
But if you were from Ukraine, your nationality would be Ukrainian. If you were from Belarus, it'd be Belarusian. And so on and so forth, right? Georgia, Latvia, doesn't matter. That was your nationality, except for the Jews who were Jewish. It doesn't matter where you were from. Um, but the Ukrainians, who the Russians kind of looked down on as kind of these like Hicks and Rubes,
Yeah.
were still Slavs, right? They were still Slavic. So they got more respect than I would say like the Azerbaijanis would have, or the Armenians would have, or the Georgians. Like they were still ethnic Slavs along with Belarus, or Belarusia as it was called back then. And what I think is really relevant to note is that the way that so they kind of looked at them as Hicks, but they didn't look at them with the same disdain ethnically as they looked at some other republics that were maybe darker skinned or whatever. What is fascinating now is that the way that they talk about Ukrainians, if you watch Russian TV or you listen to their media in any capacity, is they talk about them as though they are subhuman. So they talk about them the way that Nazis used to talk about Russians. Untermenschen, right? Except that's the German word for it, but the Russians kind of imply the same thing in Russian. And that's as Nazi as it gets. That is what the Third Reich was actually based on, this ethnic hierarchy, where some people were less human than others, and some people, like Jews, were inhuman, period. So to me, there's no amount of gaslighting, except for when Donald Trump said that it's Ukraine that started the war. That was fantastic. Chef's kiss gaslighting there, Mr. President. But there's
Hmm.
no bigger gaslighting from my worldview than accusing the Ukrainians of being neo-Nazis. Because you only need to read Mein Kampf, which I have, and I'm sure other people on this chat have as well. I don't know if you have, Olga, to understand that a lot of the rhetoric that the Kremlin and their allies in the media are using now is not so far removed from what you would
Yeah,
read in Mein Kampf. And some of
yeah.
the things that they are doing is not so far removed from what the Nazis did, including the torture of prisoners, the medical experiments on prisoners, um, the abduction of children from less desirable houses and kind of rehoming them
And
to
just the
precarious
kidnapping
families.
of children to end the lineage of Ukrainians. I mean, the
Yeah.
whole purpose of kidnapping the children, and they stated very clearly on TV, um, and raping women to the point of like, the worst trauma, because it's not just rape. I mean, it's rape and torture, is to so they can never birth Ukrainian children. I mean, and they clearly flaunt it on TV as their goal, and you have their top political scientists who, you know, are telling people, scratch my head because in the West, especially United States, like you have the media and, you have people, well, we need to investigate whether this is genocide, what's happening or not genocide, and whatnot. Whereas so you watch Russian TV or, listen to Putin or any of the Duma members, which are the politicians, the propagandists, they tell you what they're doing, their goal is. And they even some of them refer to Ukrainians as biological matter. And they're like, we need to preserve the sculptures and the architecture and remove the biological matter. And then
Well,
again, as you know, they were treated a drop better, but don't forget, Stalin did commit Holodomor, and he murdered millions of Ukrainians
yeah.
with the famine and by robbing Ukrainians. So, I mean, this is basically a repeat of what Stalin started and, what Putin now wants to end. He doesn't want you now, I mean, they've gotten to the point that Ukrainians don't exist, period. They're just like an artificial created, you know, nationality, whereas they have their culture and their history going way back, I mean, centuries before even Moscow.
Yeah, I mean, Kievan
So,
Rus was where it all began, by the way. So, um, uh,
and
that
then just to put it into practical matter, I mean, if that's not bad enough after the full scale, after the illegal annexation of Russia, of Ukraine, Russia sent in, the little green men, and they were comprised of Nazi units, including Rusich, which the leader of Rusich is a self-proclaimed Nazi who, hails Hitler. Then you have them supporting all the far right groups in the United States, the Nazi groups in the United States, like the base. They provided paramilitary training to the base across all of Europe. So, I mean, Russia, has really, like, their security services has carried out this very extensive co opting and putting together of Nazi groups across, the globe. putting them together to basically overthrow democracy. This is one of their operations of subverting democracies. So, on top of just, the fact that everything is absurd on face value, Russia is the one who has Nazi groups that they have been using in Ukraine, who support Nazi groups. And Putin, when he was in Dresden as a KGB officer, he was a handler to a famous Nazi that he sent into West Germany in order to recruit more Nazis. So we can have this discussion all day, but Russia's full of shit, as
Yeah,
always.
I think that's that's just that's all that really has to be said. They also demanded, Olga, so, okay, a lot of Ukrainians have died. A lot of Ukrainian civilians have died. A lot of military people who were not military people before but took up arms have died to prevent this next thing from coming. But one of the demands that the Russians have is international recognition of Russian control over, and I'm going to spell this out slowly because apparently Steve Witkoff, who's negotiating on behalf of the United States with Vladimir Putin, did not know the names of the regions in Ukraine that the Russians want control over, which makes you wonder what the hell is he doing in the Kremlin? Others,
Not
but
negotiating.
yeah, not negotiating. He wanted control. Russia wants control over Crimea, which it illegally annexed and seized in 2014. Sevastopol, which is part of the Crimea Peninsula, but they also the four regions in East Ukraine that they've been fighting over right now, which is Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing this with a Russian accent to my Ukrainian friends. It's the only way I know how to pronounce it. But those are the four regions that apparently Steve Witkoff did not know or could not name that the Russians have been fighting over with the Ukrainians for the last.
And they don't even control it all.
Yeah, they don't control it all at all. In fact, back and forth a lot of, especially in Kherson. Um, but like when I talk about unconditional surrender, Olga, this is what I'm talking about, right? Because the next thing after they get that is, oh yeah, also we want to go as far west as Kiev and maybe Lviv. Lviv, sorry, it's called Ukrainian. So and of course, they want this all to be a legally binding agreement with enforcement mechanisms, which means that if the Ukrainians say no thanks, I guess the United States is now going to come in on the part of the Russians to help enforce it. That is what Steve Witkoff, who I was pleased to see even Rupert Murdoch's New York Post basically called an unmitigated moron today, has been negotiating.
Yeah.
Scott, there's somebody in the chat named Scott said, any idea how the average Russian feels about this war? So, of course, there's not really any polling in Russia that's impartial. But, understand, imagine if all you had access to was Fox News 24/7 for 20 years and no other media.
And not only media, imagine being raised and indoctrinated that you're the supreme race and that basically no one else, you should have control because you deserve it. I mean, this is, you're right as the supreme race that, every country, every territory, everything belongs to you. So, I mean, so I personally think, just a lot do. Others are just apolitical and frankly don't care. They just go about their lives day to day.
Yeah, and when you I I had this conversation with somebody about what it must have been like living in Berlin in 1934, right? Like about a year, maybe even 35, 36, a couple years after Hitler came to power. And you just go about your day. You just go about your life, right? It only gets bad when the war comes to you and the privation comes to you and people start dying, which is why the Ukrainians are fighting for their lives. But if you're the average Russian, you just don't want to talk about it. And by the way, you have been raised in an environment going back to the Soviet days of you don't talk about politics because it's dangerous. So just stay away. Keep your head down, go about your day, and that's that. And so the Russians that I have, well, I haven't spoken to any that my mother's is still in touch with, some of her friends back from the 60s, 70s. They don't, they have somehow had this unspoken rule. They just don't talk about the war. They just they don't want to talk about it. She wants to talk to them about it. And they just shut her down because it's dangerous. You don't know who's listening. And if you're polled, you're never going to give an honest answer because you don't know if the pollster is going to report back on you. I mean, we're living in a society, both here in the United States, and they're certainly living in a society where the denunciations are happening, right? Here, it's a little bit premature to say that, but, you know, I expect to get audited, Olga, pretty soon. I don't know about you. Um, the more you speak out, I think the more it's going to be painful. Over there, the more you speak out or even like a post, you end up in prison. So most people, I think, just don't want to even focus. They just want to move on with
Yeah,
their life.
it's a mixed. I have, a more negative feeling about it. And again, I dealt with this in 2014
Mhm.
because I am Ukrainian and Russian. I have family in both. And I can tell you, I mean, on the Russian side, people that I deal with, even the ones who like oppose the war, um, I mean, their opposition is, protecting the Russians. Well, this is Putin. No, it's not Putin. And I have only a handful of Russian friends, and literally when I say a handful, like, a handful, less than 5 fingers, um, that, actually put the blame where it is assigned. And if you notice with the Russian opposition parties, they're always putting it on Putin, and I'm like, "This is not Putin walking in and raping, women and cutting tongues for, not displaying loyalty to Russia and whatnot." So I have a little bit more of a mixed view, and I'll just give a quick story. I went to with my mom because my mom is the Russian one, even
Mhm.
though she luckily never got indoctrinated. And when she
Right.
came here, she wanted to forget everything about there because of her trauma. But we were in Poland. We had to go. I had a conference in Prague, and then we had a connecting flight in Poland, and we're on our way back to US. A young Russian woman from Moscow, very hip, very, Dior sneakers, very whatnot.
Mm.
Gets on the plane. She's sitting right next to us. She hears us speaking Russian. And then she chimes in, "Oh, you're Russian, whatever." Very nice woman, very, young 30s, whatever. Starts crying. She's on her way to Brooklyn. Her father just died. She's not going to make the funeral and whatnot. And she's like, "Oh my God, I barely even got on this plane." And then she, because of the sanctions and the everything, and she had to go through Belarus and whatever. Anyway, so on the plane, everything, whatever. My mom was like, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry to hear about your father, whatever." I mean, it took 15 minutes into speaking with her where she's like, "Now we took, Polish Air, which is amazing. They don't stop feeding you. I mean, you can't even close your eyes. They're constantly feeding you, feeding you." She's
Right.
like, "Oh, this doesn't compare to our float." My mom, like, literally,
Airflot's
it's
the
one of
worst there.
yeah, it triggered her so bad that she's like, "Well, why don't you go take your hour float?" She's like, "Maybe you can't because your country's committing genocide." The woman just sat there. My mom put her earplugs in, and that's it. And it just goes back to the mentality. I mean, you're in your 30s. Like, why? If you're sitting on a plane, you should be grateful you found a plane to take you back. Like, why do you need to go back to your imperialism and say, "Oh, my plane is better than this," you know? And it just is ingrained in this. I
It
grew
is
up in the
ingrained.
community, and it's
But
just,
by the way, I don't know if you know this, right before we got on air, and I don't know that people know this, apparently Mike Waltz is out as national security advisor.
oh, bye
Over
bye.
over the signal thing, as is his deputy Alex Wong, who I guess Trump is punishing them for mistakenly putting
Or
technical
Laura
ability.
Loomer
Well, Laura Loomer is nowhere
is
about.
punishing them.
The sensible reason is the signal chat, in which case, why is Pete Hegseth still there? But this is more like Laura Loomer, I think, just didn't want Mike Waltz there. And God help us, who's going to be the next national security advisor?
I mean,
If Laura
America
Loomer
is
making these
lost.
decisions now, right?
America, honestly, for now, this time being, until people come out. Today is May Day. So after this, um, go find
Oh,
your local protest
yeah.
and show, that you don't agree with this regime. But yeah. So yeah, to sum up basically with these so you have Russia proposing this, bullshit ceasefire for 3 days so they don't have drones hitting them while they're celebrating. You have Lavrov at the same time basically, putting proposals that are insane, which is exactly what they were arguing in 2021, before the full scale invasion. And that's it. And it just shows you this is not going anywhere. And the NATO part actually, kind of makes me laugh because at the rate that the US is going, NATO is not going to exist. Because Trump is throwing wrenches and doing everything to make sure that NATO is obsolete. And I'm hoping if anyone listen to me in European circles that Europe, Canada, and Ukraine, being that they're the ones who have, the battle testing and actually know how to fight in different conditions between guerrilla and advanced technology warfare and whatnot, that they form their own bloc. So you know what? I'm hoping that, you know, uh, Russia demands Ukraine can be in NATO. Hopefully, there will be a new European alliance with Canada, maybe Japan, South Korea, Ukraine that can come together and it'll just, keep US out of it because we've lost our mind here. And that's that. And the last thing I'll say as far as indoctrination, people for years have always asked, like, how are they so brainwashed in Russia and how do they continue to repeat and buy this propaganda? You know what? I ask the same of Americans now because we are in America, the most open society, and you have literally 1/3 of the country who are hardcore believers, who are, basically doing everything to bring in a dictator and make sure he solidifies his power. So before now, before I would have to explain why Russians are like this. Now I'd like to know, why 1/3 of this country is so hardcore that they will go for every single unconstitutional thing as long as they're, a freaking leader. Some of them even turned him into Jesus. As long as he, how you call it, says it. And he can, just like Putin, today he says one thing, and you have the whole base railing, against the person he railed at. Tomorrow, this person is wonderful, and you have the whole base praising this person. Putin did this with Prigozhin very publicly. One day he called him a terrorist and an enemy to the state. The next day, or like not even, maybe 36 hours later, he suddenly, because he wanted to like kind of sweep under the rug the Prigozhin's march on Moscow, and he said, oh, he's a patriot. And then you have all the propagandists repeating he's a patriot. Literally, it's the same thing like here. So,
Yeah. Um, I want to talk about also something that I think is you mentioned in one of your Substack posts, but there's a dossier that the Russians are building. It's basically a hit list on
mhm,
journalists, politicians, bloggers, potentially across Europe.
mhm,
I don't think it's just Europe.
no.
Um, I think we're probably we know we're on at least one list because they publicly released that list. But and it's they're ordering the GRU, which is one of the Russian intelligence services, is ordering their agents to collect home addresses of Kremlin critics um, for active measures, which is the Russian word for um, a hit list,
Uh,
basically
Assassinations.
assassination. Um, this is kind of out in the open, and I don't know what Europe is doing about this. I don't expect this administration to do anything about this because I'm sure there's probably a significant overlap between people who are critical of Trump and critical of Putin. So therefore, Trump will not want to do anything about this. So I think we're kind of on our own. But what is Europe doing about this, if anything?
Nothing. And this is one of the things that has really driven me nuts because you had Russia carrying out, the first assassination of Litvinenko. And I believe it was what, 2007, if
Yep.
I'm correct. Um, they used polonium. So it's not that Russia, just hired someone to go and, shoot the guy. Um, they used polonium, a chemical weapon, on British soil to kill. He was a former FSB operative, KGB FSB, who had escaped. I actually know the person who helped him escape Russia, and then
Yeah.
they traveled around and made their way to London, and then he was cooperating with MI6 and I believe Italian security services. Europe did nothing. Then you had, I actually have a file documenting every assassination since the 1990s. Um, by the later 2000s, and then in the 2010s, you just had a slew of assassinations. Russia didn't hide it. They, very clearly want, because they assassinate by different ways, and they have categories of their signature killings. So, for instance, being he was FSB, they use polonium, a poisoning, or they use Novichok. Critics in Russia that they want to silence, they'll literally throw them out the window. To the point, I remember one was inside the Interior Ministry. He was testifying against someone in Moscow, like providing information, and fell out the window out of Interior Ministry. So that's equivalent to someone here cooperating with FBI and then falling out the window in the middle of his uh, you know, interview. And they use window killings a lot just to silence people. I remember a famous one. A woman was on a conference call during COVID and the hospital that she runs, and right in the middle of the conference call, she fell out the window to her death. So, but you have had so many, dozens and dozens of assassinations, and GRU is the one who, for the most part, carries them out. And they're happening all across Europe. Frankly, I'll argue they have been happening in the United States also, but I don't think that the US wants to acknowledge. That Russia is carrying out assassinations here, because if they acknowledge it, then you have to actually
Do
do
something about
something
it.
and
Yeah.
have a policy. But we've had several, assassinations, including Listen, who was the head of RT, who came to US, was, there were reports that he was going to uh, cooperate with the FBI and provide information, and he was, fell to his death in DuPont Circle, drunk, allegedly. There are too many to name. But now Russia,
And let me just
so
stop you
let's,
on that for a second. They kind of want you to know that it was them because there's other ways
yes,
to kill people. The
yes,
defenestration, falling out of windows, is their signature move, right? And so, uh, if they wanted to just take care of it quietly without anybody knowing about it, without
they'd
sending a
hire a
message,
hitman,
hire a hitman,
a
run
robber.
somebody over with
So,
a car. There's 100 different ways to do it, right? But it's the falling out of windows that they specifically want you to know it was them.
yep.
And
They
and
have
and and
signature killings, and they
yeah.
want to send the message while having, deniable plausibility. Go ahead.
Well, other than to say, I've always been shocked that that case never kind of was very much swept under the rug, and that happened. When was that, under Trump the first time, or was that Biden?
No, it was on, actually, interestingly, I was monitoring the chatter on that death. It was exactly November 2015 when I was picking up a lot of chatter on the attack on US,
Right.
on their blog, on their, chatter.
Uh,
Um, and it happened the beginning, like November 5th or November something of 2015. So as Trump was running for election, and he was the head of RT. Now, for people who don't know, RT is Russia Today. I have said it finally. The U.S. intelligence, actually labeled it this last year. But forever I have said this is an arm of Russian intelligence that deals with propaganda
Yeah.
overseas. So it's Sputnik and RT, and they specifically, their aim is to embed, journalists across America and, Central and South America and across the whole globe. And at the same time, co-op people. Speaking of which, Ed Martin, by the way, please call your congressperson because he's up right
Your
now for a
senator,
nomination
your
hearing.
senator, yeah.
Yeah, please call your senator. That's it. Call your senator because he's up for a confirmation hearings. He appeared over 150 times on RT or Sputnik. 150 times. He is now the interim DC, what is the Attorney General?
He's the acting United States Attorney for Washington.
Yeah, for DC. Uh,
He is uh, that is the most powerful US attorney spot outside of the Southern District of New York. It is where a lot of the political investigations come. And this is MAGA. This is not, I mean, I guess he's technically a lawyer 'cause you have to be, but much like Alina Habba, who's now the United States Attorney for New Jersey, they're not there because they're experts in
no.
prosecution. They are experts in persecution. And it is fascinating to me that, again, you put all of these little markers, all these little Putin
Yep.
apologists into these very specific places. Now, if he were in the Southern District where a lot of this intelligence stuff comes from, I would be even more panicked because that's where the investigations into, espionage
Yep.
emanates, but also out of DC. So
Yes.
putting him there is a big deal.
Yes, and the fact that I mean he is a Nazi sympathizer, he praised the Nazi sympathizer. He's a vile person. Call your senator and just tell them, please. You know, for me, the red flag, obviously, besides praising a Nazi sympathizer, the fact that he was on RT and Sputnik over 150 times, he was getting paid for these appearances. But back to the listen and just in general, Russia has carried out killings across European soil. Like I said, I personally believe in US. And now, so last year they instructed, basically to disappear Russians who are critics. And they said, Lugavoy at the time put out a statement, disappeared them like dogs, I mean, whether they overdose or they just disappear and no one knows where they are or whatever, but get rid of them. Now, this January, this is how emboldened they are since Trump. They literally assigned the whole GRU unit, which is military intelligence, responsible for the decades of carrying out, the assassinations across Europe to collect information on every single person. So before it was like reserved to hire like more influential people who are making a difference. Now they want a list of every single person overseas in US. They're saying Europe. I believe it's in US, trust me. And in Europe, basically whether it's a blogger or a journalist or whoever it is, and we've already had a few cases, even I believe it was last year or the end of 23, where there's a woman, Natalie Ardo, who runs the Russian foundation in DC. She went overseas on a conference and was poisoned. And you see these cases increasing. But now, interestingly, they feel so emboldened since Trump came back that they now expanded their directive to collect and even more people to go after. And these are a kill list.
Yeah. And what's fascinating to me is this is a country that has a lot of potential. And if they spend as much time building it up as they are engaging in this kind of sabotage all over the world, and not just here, but militarily, which we'll get to in a moment, um, you know, it's it's pretty incredible. But what's also incredible is that you have Elon Musk, who now has collected through Doge all of our personal data and all of our personal information.
Hmm.
I'm not suggesting he's a Russian spy because there's no evidence of that, and I certainly have don't I don't believe that, but maybe whatever. But this is not somebody who's particularly careful with
Yeah.
information. And if it is on private servers somewhere in one place, as opposed to the disparate places that it was in across agencies before, including all of our medical information and our medical records, which are completely proprietary, including access to all of our electronic devices. Um, it's not going to be that hard to find out and track literally what every single person is doing at any given moment, what their vulnerabilities are, what their secrets are, what their health information is that they might not want people to be aware of,
Who their
um,
children are,
where their children are, what their
which
children
is
are
a
doing.
common tactic to silence people by
Yep,
threatening them, their children.
yep. You know, every time you write a check to that college for your kid to go to college, they now know where your kid goes to college, right? They have access to those databases too. If you have a federal student loan, they know where that's coming from. If you need Head Start money for your kid, they know where that's coming from. If your child has a library card, they know where that's coming from. All of that, thanks to AI, is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly easy. And that is the kind of horror and devastation that is going to cost untold lives. So I don't know that the Russians need a hit list to destroy people. I mean, certainly they, but you can destroy somebody very easily just
The
by
Russians like to kill people because that's just their ammo. Because this is again going back to
right.
Soviet days, and now they want to. But as far as Musk and the surveillance, this is something that I cannot believe. Like, I really cannot believe American media
I've
is not only focusing on it, they're irresponsibly reporting what is happening. And I wrote an article last month about Doge building a surveillance state and being covered for that. And I am telling you, this is the most, out of everything Trump says, everything he does, his loyalty cabinet meetings, the stupid, freaking Chinese made Gulf of America, quote unquote, hats. Out of everything he's doing, the most dangerous is Doge,
yep.
because what they are doing is fusing every single government database together. And from there, they can easily have AI separate and create target list. And then Trump can say, okay, this group of people, ask AI to go sift through who are the most problematic Democrats and who will be the most problematic opposition figures. I'm not talking about leaders, I'm talking about people, activists. And then they can go start targeting that list to quell dissent before it even, before people even organize and really start pushing.
And
So this is the most dangerous thing. And I cannot, every time I hear, I'm sorry, CNN and MSNBC and everyone carrying on, oh, they were supposed to save 2 trillion. I want to scream. I want to take my TV and throw it out the window and shake every anchor to wake up and actually tell people what is happening.
well, I just as you were talking went to the New York Times homepage right now, and what is called above the fold in the physical paper is what is above the fold at the top,
Mhm.
third of the Times homepage. And I'm just going to give you four stories, big stories that they're running. Right. The first is the ouster of Mike Waltz, which is merits
Bye bye.
story. Okay, but that merits coverage. With mineral deal, President Trump ties himself to Ukraine's future. Okay, that's an analysis. The U.S. Ukraine mineral deal, what we know. Okay, fine. And then, actually, a much bigger font and a much bigger photograph than anything about Ukraine is reality TV wades into cross generational dating pools.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
I get it. I get that they make money on clicks. And I get that a lot of people need some diversion. And I get that's why the New York Times is making hand over fist with the Athletic and a tremendous amount of money on Wordle. And I get that this is their bread and butter now. So I'm not
Mhm.
castigating them. Everybody's got to make a living. However, what you and I just talked about should be a daily story above the fold, not just a one-off. Because I'm sure they have reporters on this nonstop about exactly what Doge is doing with our information. I'm sure eventually they will run that story, and then that story will go away, and we will go back to 5 ingredients: spicy honey chicken and broccoli wolf week, right? Which is the other big story right now. As I'm
do,
looking at the
do
front.
the mass detention centers that they're building out right now, do they
Now,
serve this
listen, I'm going to
recipe?
just say this. Yesterday, or 2 days ago, excuse me, Donald Trump held a rally. We're going a little afield here, but not really. Donald Trump held a rally in Michigan, and he gave 30 seconds of time at that rally to my occasional sparring partner on CNN, Scott Jennings, who clearly workshopped what he was going to say very carefully, because I've never seen a more thirsty person trying very, very, very hard to try to
I
be funny.
saw it. I was like,
And
wow,
and
he
and
got on
Scott
his plane
and Scott
finally.
Jennings said, as I was on the plane, so he wanted all of us to know that he's flying on Air Force One with Trump. Congratulations, Scott. And I know Scott, so like I say this with some experience here as to what we're talking about. Scott Jennings said, I was flying on the plane and I looked down at all the farmland and I said to myself, I got to buy some farmland here because of all the liberals. I need a place to put all the liberals that I own every day. Okay. First of all, I've been on countless shows with Scott. I am a liberal. If Scott thinks he owns me or anybody else, like, delusion is a really powerful drug, but great. But the part that I think is really interesting is not really so much about Scott Jennings, but about what they're saying. They're talking about creating camps to put their political
Mhm.
opponents. And ha ha ha. And Scott thought that was really funny, except that, believe me, they're not joking.
No, nope.
They're not joking.
And they're testing it out right now with the new emergency powers, giving military the right to take over basically the edges of 3 states, and that, they can use military on U.S. soil. Again, right now they're testing it on immigrants. This is coming for all of us if we don't push back. They're
Yep.
not joking.
They're not joking. And I think that's something that people need to be aware of, because it's not, I know we always say can't happen here, but of course it can happen here.
It is happening.
And I have to tell you, I was shocked, and I was just on CNN this morning, which is why, I look a little different than I usually look for these shows. But so I'm saying this as somebody who's there multiple times a week. The fact that CNN said, yeah, no problem, that Scott Jennings just showed up at this rally. I don't care if Scott Jennings shows up at a rally, but listen to the message. He's talking about owning libs on his network and putting them in, I guess, in camps, farms in Michigan. I don't want to go to Michigan to a farm, Olga, do you?
No, thank you. No, no.
Yeah.
I'll
So,
go. I'll go, keep going to Canada.
yeah.
I'll be
So
happy
my
to go to
point is,
Canada.
my point is, like, it's happening. It's called the fucking gulag, right? And if you don't think that this is coming here, it's coming here. The only question is, do we do something about it first? And as you said, it is May 1. Please today find a protest, go march, find, more importantly, a town hall. Please go there and complain to your member of Congress, if they're Democrats, that they're not doing enough, if they're Republicans, that they're really not doing enough to stand up to this. I don't care.
Doing
I don't care
nothing.
which party represents you, because there is a lot of stuff to worry about.
And
But
then just to add what you're saying, they're also expanding. I mean, El Salvador, we've seen what is happening, throwing people in a black, hole, basically offsite black hole. But they're expanding it now, and they want to include Rwanda and Libya. So I mean, trust me, no one, like, if we don't stop this and push this back against this now, people like you and I are going to be in Rwanda with zero rights, or in Libya in a torture camp with zero rights. And any American will be disappeared. They're disappearing babies. That's not a coincidence. They're right now testing the disappearing of Americans. And, now the mother signed. No, the mother didn't sign. No, the father and the judge were trying to find their freaking 2-year-old child. And the judge is sitting and trying, had an emergency hearing to locate this child, only hours later to be found out that the child was taken, a U.S. citizen, out of Honduras to Honduras. They're testing it right
who,
now
who,
on.
who, by the way, has metastatic cancer and was sent to Honduras or wherever. Was it Honduras? I think it was whatever country they were sent to. Um,
Three U.S.
yeah,
citizen children were sent.
without their medicine. This is
Hmm.
a small child under the age of 10 with metastatic cancer.
Yep.
I mean,
Yeah, stage
it's
4 cancer.
yeah. So as much as we sit here and complain about Putin all the time, as we should, as much as we talk about the atrocities, and somebody here asked, as we talked about earlier, what does the average Russian think, and presumably what is the average Russian doing? Well, what is the average American doing?
Yeah, we need to push back now because I don't think, I mean, Trump, is going to leave Putin in the dust. He's using all his tested tactics, to gain control over agencies, over the people, over media, over everything. He's using the playbook, to consolidate power. But Trump is going to make Putin look like, after he finishes, because he has a U.S. military behind him. He has all the best agencies in the world, gold standard. Our Department of Justice used to be gold standard. Now, the fact of flipping it over to use it against opposition and people like Chris Krebs and Blue and, things like that, we are not even, 6 months in. We're only 3 months in. And there was actually in New York Times, they did do something useful analysis. He has carried out in 100 days over 100 acts of retribution.
Yep.
100 against law, arresting judges, going after critics, stripping national security clearances, opening investigations into Act Blue and other Democrats. So I mean, we need to push back, and this is the one thing we can do. And
Yeah.
because we don't want to be like Russia.
And briefly, because I'm conscious of the time, I do want to talk about, speaking of Russia, how the Russians are basically we're. I know this is going to sound alarmist, and I know it's going to sound crazy, but it's not. We are effectively in World War III. People need to understand that, right? In the
Yeah.
same way that the World War II didn't start on September 1st, 1939, it started many years earlier with the Spanish Civil War, and that was a test run for World War II. In the same way that we are in World War III now, I believe that the day that Russia actively invaded Ukraine was the beginning of World War III, and you see that now, Olga, because you also mentioned something that I think is important for people to know. The Russians are engaged in military activity off the waters of our NATO allies. They are still our NATO allies for now, and sometimes on the border of NATO countries like Finland, which is
Hmm.
just so happens to be one of the closer countries to them in the NATO alliance. So why don't we talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's very important for people to understand. Just because we are not dying yet doesn't mean that people are not dying, and doesn't mean that they are not engaged in military activity hostile to this country and hostile to our allies.
Yep. So let me wrap it up in just a few points to make it into a package. As Trump runs around with this, sham plan that he's trying to end the war, and on the day, by the way, that Trump betrayed Ukraine by claiming, the U.S. is going to recognize Crimea, which is illegal. Um, Putin at the same time, this is what kicked it off. I mean, it's not, but it's one of the main pointers we could discuss for the week. Putin held a meeting with the military industrial complex saying that, we need to ramp up production of military, all categories, tanks and satellites and this. And I mean, literally every category of military weapons he wants to ramp up. He gave an order, expanded it to 400 companies that should now participate. And he made a very clear statement that, we will be facing in a war and it's going to be sooner rather than later. They're not talking about Ukraine, and the type of equipment that he expanded is not for Ukraine. This is now for Europe. Um, at the same time, before yesterday, Peskov, who's Putin's press secretary, came out and basically again talked about the fact that Russia is now prepared as they were during the Second World War, and that they can, reach full mobilization. So now, mind you, Trump is selling peace here, with his lies, and that Putin wants peace. The Russians are clearly publicly stating Putin held this military industrial meeting very publicly at the same time that Trump was, throwing Crimea to the Russians illegally. Peskov very publicly came out and said that the Russians are now fully ready, as they were during the Second World War, to have a full mobilization and achieve victory. Again, this is not talking about Ukraine. This is they're looking for the next war. And at the same time, I mean, besides the fact, but we'll take the snapshot, now. Um, there have been unusual movements on Finland's border, bases popping up on the Russian side of Finland's border, and just unusual movements like they are preparing for something. This is also has been happening for a few years in Belarus, which lines Lithuania and Poland. And this is happening, frankly, on all borders to Europe. So they're looking for their next war. And just to tie up this, as the US is betraying and walking away from Europe, Russia is looking to start a war in Europe. And about a year ago, it was very interesting. January of 2025, and then it kept going on. Every single European intelligence agency, every single country was sounding the alarm, and they continue to sound the alarm that uh, Russia may invade, a NATO country within, some said 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, different assessments, but they are all picking up the same thing, that Russia is preparing to either invade the Baltics or Poland or a combination. And then the last thing I'll say, this is why it is so important for Ukraine to stand, because Ukraine is holding the Russians back. If Ukraine falls, and I can tell you this is what's been happening since 2014, then Russia will force Ukrainians and immediately build up their military, army to double the size. They'll force Ukrainians to go and fight, under duress. And this has been happening since 2014, where Russia uses Ukrainians in occupied territories, literally under a gun to your head, threats that your family will be murdered, and throws you onto the front line, which, by the way, is another war crime, to go and kill your fellow Ukrainians. And they've been testing this tactic since 2014 in occupied territories. Should Ukraine fall, this is going to spread across everywhere. And then Russia will suddenly go from whatever, say, 500,000 man army to, say, 700,000 or 600,000 man army, and then force Ukrainians to go kill Europeans. So this is why all of this is so important, and this is why it is the most fucking absurd, and I apologize, thing, because that day last week when I saw Witkoff sitting with Putin again, the fourth time, literally you have Witkoff on one side with a Russian translator that he has no clue where she came from. He asked, is she from the US Embassy? Or is she provided by the Kremlin? On the other side, you had Putin and a whole line of his senior officials. This is what we're dealing with. You have a big threat. And then Russia, just to finish it up, Russia and China are coordinating. And I promise you that, should Russia start making moves, China will immediately move towards Taiwan to
Oh,
distract on that.
no question about it. And
And
don't forget,
North Korea.
and North
Because,
Korea. I was about to say, don't forget about North Korea. You want to talk about an axis of evil? There you go.
yeah,
And
yep.
for every single person in this country who doesn't think that they are fighting for us, understand that the parallels to World War II are striking.
Mhm.
Japan attacked us 2 years, over 2 years after World War II began in Europe. But eventually it comes to our shores and will always come to our shores. We got into World War II late compared to the Europeans. World War I, excuse me, and World War II. But we
Yep.
did. And rather than shaking down the Ukrainians and having them reimburse us, as the president first wanted to do, thank God that didn't end up in this deal, but who the hell knows?
Yeah.
The
2
day is
more to
young.
go.
Yeah, the day is young. Um, Instead of demanding that they reimburse us for the military aid we gave them, we should be paying them because they are dying for us. It is coming. There is, I've said this repeatedly, and I really mean this. There are two teams right now. There's team democracy and there's team autocracy.
Mhm.
And
And Ukraine go ahead, finish, and then
well,
I'll
you're either on one or the other. And that's what I think people don't understand. Like, this is all interconnected. You're either on one or the other, which means that you can do your own part by marching down Fifth Avenue or wherever the protest is today, or you could go die in Ukraine if you're Ukrainian, but it's the same team. And they're on the same team, Trump and Putin. They are. No matter how much Trump wants to say he's neutral, no matter how much Trump wants to say, well, now I've got this rare earth mineral deal with Ukraine, and therefore I have a vested interest in Ukraine's survival. Bullshit.
Mhm. Yep. And just to add, in 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukraine was the testing ground of what, was a laboratory. Georgia in 2008, then Ukraine in 2014, and it was basically a testing ground for Russia's hybrid warfare. All the cyber attacks, taking down a power grid, um, oh, everything, every single thing, the disinformation operations, the malign influence operations. Ukraine was a testing ground for this. Ukraine is now again a testing ground for, the escalation of war because you have the Chinese fighting in Ukraine, you have the North Koreans fighting. Russia and North Korea announced that they're, building, I think, a land bridge now, and like they're very excited to connect the two countries. You have, the Iranians fighting and providing ballistic missiles and drones and everything to Russia. You have these forces who are actively fighting in different, type of operations inside of Ukraine. Trust me, this is going. Chinese aren't there to go help Russia. Chinese are there to test their own military capabilities to see where they need to sharpen and to pick up the tactics from the Russians. They're not doing it because, they want to help Russia take over Ukraine. They're doing it for themselves for Taiwan. And North Korea, again, same. They are sending weapons and whatnot, but
And
they are
and and,
also
and
testing
Iran.
for South. Yeah.
And
So,
Iran.
I mean, this is why it's so important. And the fact that we have a real estate developer sitting there by himself with a translator he doesn't know, who's probably a honeypot, and having a conversation in a language he doesn't know. He doesn't know what she's feeding him, and he doesn't know what she's telling the Russians. He could be saying one thing, she's, translating it and delivering them another message. And
Yeah.
then you have Trump running around acting as if this is kindergarten. Oh, yeah, yeah, tomorrow, tomorrow. That's it. We have peace. There's going to be peace. These issues are so serious. And I mean, literally, and now with Trump tanking the global economy with his uncertainty, this makes the condition even more right across the globe for a full scale, World War III.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I think people are not the people who watch us, I think, are very plugged in, and we're very grateful to you and to so many of you, both here in the United States and from around the world, who join us, which we're very, very deeply grateful for, because we understand that we're all interconnected here, and that as Americans, we were the indispensable nation and that we're leading or should be leading the rest of the free world. But I think the problem is that way too many people are not going to really find out until it directly affects them. Much like they're being impacted now
Yep.
by tariffs, and back to school shopping is going to be really painful, and Christmas is going to be really painful. And Donald Trump saying you can't buy 30 toys, and you can only buy 2 now, which is, I don't know.
He's conditioning like the Soviets.
Yeah,
It's
I mean, it's
okay.
pretty,
Just
it's
be
pretty,
happy for your half a piece of bread.
by the way, who buys $30 except maybe Donald Trump's kids, grandchildren, buy $30. The rest of America can't afford 1 or 2 with these tariffs. Um,
And the amount
so
he's robbing from us, he can
yeah,
actually this year buy $180
right.
from the money
So
that he's carrying
yeah,
out with his schemes.
exactly. So it's gonna impact them when it impacts them. But unlike the economy, which is obviously very awful and is going to impact people and is going to lead to devastation, we're talking about something even worse, which is life and death. And I, the whole FAFO thing, which sorry for cursing, fuck around and find out. Um, that's okay when it comes to the economy. It's not okay, but I mean, if it comes to national security, I don't want to get to the
Yeah.
point where people who fucked around have to find out, because that means that there are people dying on battlefields.
Yeah. Yep.
So, on that happy note, it is May 1st. I'll say it again. Go find a protest. Go call your member of Congress. Go call your senator. Um, tell them they're not
Organize a
doing enough.
town hall.
Yeah, go to a town hall. Organize a town hall. You, I assume, have a phone. If you do, because you're watching us, so we assume you have some sort of electronics. Please tweet, post, do TikTok videos if you have TikTok. I don't, for reasons that I think should be apparent to anybody who cares about national security. But if you do, put it on TikTok, put it on Instagram. Just get the word out. More people need to know, and they need to know about it from people that they trust. And people they trust are people that they personally know. So go do it to your social circle, your social media circle. Hearing it from you is going to be more important than hearing it from Chuck Schumer, who's not communicating anyway. So,
Wait, he
Julie,
might send a strongly worded,
yeah, yes, yes,
post a strongly worded letter too.
yes. We're very happy. Thank you to everybody who says that we bring you guys information that you're not aware of. We're deeply grateful for that. It is our duty and our responsibility to do that. We will continue to do that every single Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern. I am going to, and Olga does this as well, for people that cannot join live or did not catch all of this live. We're going to send this out via our Substacks. So if you're a subscriber, you'll get it. If you're not a subscriber yet, please subscribe to Salty Politics, my Substack, or to Olga's Unmasking Russia and Trump Tyranny Tracker Substacks. And we really appreciate you all being here. And we're going to keep talking until they shut us up. And hopefully that will be never.
We'll still be talking.
We'll still be
From the
talking. They just might
gulag,
not.
we'll be.
We just may be doing it from some farm that that Scott Jennings wants to put us on in Michigan, but
I know.
we'll still be talking. Okay, everybody. Thank you all so
All right.
much, and have a great week. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.